As Israel's new ambassador to the United Nations, I have been charged with a sacred duty to represent the people and the state of Israel before the nations of the world. Like people everywhere, the people of Israel seek to live in peace and to see their children prosper. For the Jewish people who have suffered centuries of exile and persecution, our dream can be summed up in the words of our national anthem, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, to live as free people in our land. Tragically, since the establishment of the State of Israel, every Israeli in every generation has been touched by war and by terror. My own father, Joseph Danon, was severely wounded by terrorists while protecting the Jordan Valley during his reserve duty. After sustaining critical head injuries and hearing loss, he eventually passed away after a long and painful struggle. This was a tragedy for myself and for my family. Distinguished representatives, I have experienced firsthand the price of war. We all hope, we all pray for peace with our neighbors, and we will do all that we can to achieve this noble goal. But we will never compromise the security of the Jewish state. Today, I address this chamber at a time of great difficulty and pain in my country and for my people. This is not how I envisioned my first address here. Over the past 6 weeks, the streets of Israel have been swept by a savage tide of terror, and I am disappointed that all I hear are calls to end the cycle of violence. Let me make one thing clear. This is not a cycle of violence. These are simply unprovoked attacks against Israelis for no reason, rather than the fact that they are Jews living in their historic homeland. Like any country, Israel has the right and obligation to defend its citizens, and this is exactly what we are doing. Any country whose people were being attacked in the streets on a daily basis would act in the exact same way. Mr. President, since Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Israelis have been endured a season of sorrow. Men, women, and children have been maimed and killed in the streets of Israeli cities in broad daylight. Palestinian terrorists have chosen Israeli victims at random, using rifles and rocks, butcher knives, screwdrivers, and even two-ton vehicles to shed the blood of innocents. Israelis today know that an attack can come at any time, in any place, without warning and without mercy. From Haifa to Be'er Sheva, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Israelis walking through their own neighborhoods and constantly looking over their shoulder to see what will come. People are afraid to stop for coffee on their way to work or even to take a public bus. All of us here have families. Mothers and fathers worry that their children could be knifed to death when they leave the house, and children are worried their parents won't make it home. This is the true meaning of terror. Mr. President, when someone leaves their home holding a kitchen knife with the intention of killing another person, any person, this stems from deep hatred. When that someone is 13-year-old boy who stabs an Israeli boy riding a bicycle 15 times, this stems from a culture of hate. Nelson Mandela once said, "No one is born hating another person. People must learn to hate." Tragically, Palestinian children have been receiving lessons in hatred from their leaders, in their schools, and on children's television programs. A children's program was aired on the Palestinian Public Broadcast Corporation media station. It's called Palestine This Morning, in which a young girl recited a poem calling to kill Jews. And I'm quoting, "Barbaric monkeys, the most evil among creations, and those who murdered Allah's pious prophets. She concluded, I do not fear barbarity as long as I have my arm and my stones. Public television. As we saw here in this room, in last week's emergency session of the Security Council, many seem to be confused about the cause of the current escalation. Here, in the words of this young girl, you have the answer. An entire generation of Palestinian youth is being brainwashed with bigotry, brought up to glorify violence, and raised to dehumanize Jews. This indoctrination poisons the mind of the youth, and the results are only a Google search away. Just take a look, not now, take a look at what is trending on Palestinian social media. There are vicious cartoons showing brutal killings of Israelis. There are instructional videos for how to commit terror attack in the most efficient way. There is even an animated clip of the murder of Etam and Neama Henkin, Israeli parents who were killed in front of their children. Since most of you have not seen this clip, let me tell you that a special effort was made to show the fear and terror in the eyes of the Henkin children who were sitting in the back seat of their car as they watched their parents being murdered. It's no wonder that in this current wave of attacks, at least 9 of the attackers have been Palestinians under the age of 18. When children are taught hostility and hatred instead of math and science, when teenagers are encouraged to grab a knife instead of a book, when the youth are shown images of violence instead of a vision for peace, then they too are victims. When you ignore this deliberate corruption of the minds of children, you are not a part of the solution, you are a part of the problem. Mr. President, the history of my region demonstrates that hatred starts with falsehood and incitement and ends with violence. The spree of stabbings, shooting, and stonings we now face began with lies about the Temple Mount. President Abbas and the Palestinian leadership have repeatedly and systematically accused Israel of trying to change the status quo. This inflammatory allegation is false, and President Abbas knows it is false. Yet, this deliberate and malicious lie is told over and over again. Not only is this conspiracy theory not true, but it is also not new. Allow me to quote the following. We hereby announce that no one has any intention of infringing the rights of Muslims to the places that are holy to them. Any attempt to describe the desire of the Jews to pray at this holy place as the creation of a strategic base for an attack on the mosques of the Muslims is nothing but the fruit of fevered imagination or a malicious libel. Do the words I read sound familiar? The statement I have just read was not issued last week. It was not even issued last year. It was made in 1928. 1928, by the National Committee of the Jews of the Land of Israel. Even then, 20 years before the establishment of the State of Israel, lies were spread about the Temple Mount in order to incite violence against Jews. In the violence which followed, back then, 133 Jews were massacred and hundreds more were injured. Today, when President Abbas declares, and I quote, Israel intends to make Al-Aqsa Jewish, and says, we welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem. He understands the consequences of his words. He knows full well that it leads to new waves of violence and terror, and that lives will be lost. Then as now, the story is the same. Same plot, same characters, same ending. Actually, there is one major difference. In 1928, the convenient explanations we so often hear in this chamber didn't apply. In 1928, there was no Israeli presence on the Temple Mount. In 1928, there was no settlement, no state of Israel, and no excuses to sell to the international community. Whoever claims that Israeli actions and policies are the reason for the violence needs to learn a lesson in history. Mr. President, the Palestinians are employing old tactics and are trying to score easy victories without having to negotiate, without negotiation. They are using the violence they incited and instigated in order to manipulate the international community. Instead of penalizing the Palestinians, the international community is rewarding them. Israel is fully committed to the status quo. Under this agreement, Muslims are free to visit and pray at the compound. Members of other religions, including Jews and Christians, may only visit, and they can do so only on weekday mornings between 7 and 11 o'clock. Israel not only accepted this arrangement, it is responsible for enforcing it. The facts speak for themselves. Let me share with you some numbers. Every year, there are approximately 3.5 million visits by Muslims who come to pray in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and 80,000 non-Muslims visit the site, which only 12,000 are Jews. The status quo on the Temple Mount is the only guarantee for freedom of religion in Jerusalem. We have said it before and we'll say it again. Israel will not agree to an international presence on the Temple Mount. If the international community wishes to be constructive, it should focus on ending the incitement. Mr. President, no nation represented in this chamber would accept the presence of international forces on their capital. I would like to say to my colleague, the French representative, we know that your country wants to see peace in our region. We too want peace, but the only way to peace is with direct talks between the parties. It is the only way. It was proven in the past, and it is the only way to promote peace. The best way to reduce tensions in the region is to urge President Abbas to accept Prime Minister Netanyahu's call to meet with him, here in the UN, in Ramallah, in Jerusalem, wherever. This is the only way to promote peace. Mr. President, Israel opposes any change in the status quo on the Temple Mount. The place where the status quo needs to change is here, at the UN. If the UN is truly interested in calming tensions and bringing peace to the region, it must change its default settings. The UN must end its usual practice of calling on both sides to show restraint and state clearly there is one side that is instigating a wave of terror. Stop making excuses for the Palestinians and start holding them accountable. Demand that Abbas cease his incitement. Insist that he return to the negotiation table. Only then, once the Palestinians see that promoting violence will get them nowhere, will the reality on the ground change and the prospects of peace return. Mr. President, please allow me to conclude with a quote from the Bible. Adonai oz le'amo iten, Adonai yevarech et amo b'shalom. The Lord will give strength unto his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I speak to you today after my first address at the Security Council as Israel ambassador to the UN. I just returned from Israel a few hours ago, where I accompanied the Secretary General, who witnessed firsthand the tide of terror that continues in the streets of Israel. We visited a hospital where we saw the direct consequences of the horrific attacks. The terrorists who drive their cars into civilians and who go on stabbing sprees in the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Be'er Sheva, you name it, all have one thing in common. Their minds are inflamed with hate, and this is a direct result of the incitement against Israel. Incitement coming from the leadership of the Palestinians. And when I stood yesterday with the Secretary General in the Hadassah and Karem emergency room, a son of one of the victims approached us, and he asked the Secretary General to make sure that the incitement will stop. The incitement in the social media that led to the attack and that led to the situation where his father is now struggling in the hospital. Only yesterday, the Palestinian representative stood here and denied that the PA teaches its students to hate. Well, the facts speak for themselves. I have here with me more examples from the Palestinian Authority educational system which clearly incite against the state of Israel and encourage the killing of Jews. You will excuse me, I do not have the time now to read to you all of the information, but I will give it to you. Mansour writes hundreds of letters to the Security Council. He had spoken at countless events in the UN. Yet, maybe you can help me finding even one condemnation of Palestinian terror. I couldn't find it. One. The denial of Mansour is not surprising. He does this to divert the discussion away from the toxic statements made by President Mahmoud Abbas. He said that he welcomed every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem. He said that the Jews desecrate Al-Aqsa with their filthy feet. I wonder if, according to Mansour's standards, this counts as incitement, or maybe it's educational material. Ladies and gentlemen, enough with the incitement. Let's speak about the facts. Every year there are 3.5 million visits by Muslims to pray in Al-Aqsa Mosque. Only 80,000 visits of non-Muslims at the Temple Mount. Only 12,000 of these visits were by Jews. Israel was and is committed to preserving the status quo and will not agree to an international presence on Temple Mount. When 43 people were killed and thousands were injured in anti-government protests on the streets of Venezuela, was there any call for international forces to be stationed in Caracas? I'm not familiar with that. In France in 2005, civil unrest broke. Nearly 10,000 cars were set ablaze. The French authorities declared a state of emergency, and yet no one suggested the solution was to send UN observers to the Champs-Élysées. Ladies and gentlemen, I call on the Security Council to stop making excuses for the Palestinians and call on Abbas and the Palestinian leadership to cease immediately the incitement and violence. These are fragile days. If the international community really wants to help, it should urge President Mahmoud Abbas to accept Prime Minister's repeated calls to meet with him. This is the only way to promote peace in the region. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, can I pose the first question? Okay, thank you. I want to pose the same question that Israeli columnist Danon Levy.
Where are you from? I'm sorry, I just didn't get your name.
Al-Quds al-Arabi. Danon Levy, in an article in Haaretz, posed a few questions, and I want to repeat those questions. He said, do you expect the Palestinians, seeing their land confiscated, settlements being built on their land, provocation in Jerusalem, children burn in their homes, not to be angry. Is there any example in history? He said that there is occupation without seeing the occupied people in a state of anger and rage. Thank you.
I will urge Mr. Gideon Levy from Haaretz newspaper and yourself to learn history. And history shows us that the incitement was there before the establishment of the State of Israel. And I read it inside in the Security Council. In 1928 there was incitement. In 1936 there was incitement. In 1948, and it continues. It has nothing to do with settlement. It has nothing to do with occupation. It has to do with incitement that continues for centuries.
Stephanie Renaud, Jewish Press. One of the most disturbing features about the escalating violence recently is the fact that so many of the perpetrators are actually ID holding Israeli citizens. What do you think the Israeli government can do to decrease the amount of these attacks being made really by Israelis on Israelis, Israeli Arabs, Israelis who proclaim themselves Palestinians?
We see that the incitement has no borders. It affects the minds of youngsters who live in Judea and Samaria, of youngsters who live in East Jerusalem, who are resident, not citizens of Israel, and also the youngsters who are Arab Israelis, who are full citizens. I think we should fight the incitement. And I think what we are doing today in Israel, we're deploying forces, we're taking security measures, but for the long run, we have to fight with the core of the evil, which is the incitement. Thank you very much. We have to go back, so one more question, please.
What do you have to say about the credible reports that UNRWA employees, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, employees of them are inciting violence and glorifying the so-called martyrdom attacks?
We have seen the information. It is disturbing to see a UN organization that pays salaries to people who promote violence, and I can assure you that we will deal with that issue in the future. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.